Paul has authored 16 books and is highly recognized and well known as a commentator on Catholicism and the papacy. He also has a strong interest in ethics, environmental, and population issues. Paul has a master's degree in theology from Harvard University and a doctorate of philosophy in history from the Australian National University. He lives in Canberra, Australia, with Marilyn and their family. And did I say that right, Paul? Okay, I'll hand it over to you. Correct me.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Deb. From Canberra, Australia. And that's how it's normally said, although quite a few people still say Canberra. But we were assured by the princess back in 1928, I think, who launched Canberra, that it was to be called Canberra. So there you are. Well, now, I think the first thing we should do is we should have a round of applause for Benedict XVI, because he did the most important thing that any pope has done since, 1294. He resigned from the papacy. I'll explain why I think that's so important in a moment. Just going back to the previous gentleman who resigned from the papacy, a gentleman named Celestine V. He had a rather brief papacy. It only lasted 5 months. So it wasn't a long papacy. And it was in the middle of a kind of a political storm about who was going to control the papacy. And he was eventually overthrown by his successor, Boniface VIII, who church historians would largely consider to have been barking mad. That is not true of Benedict XVI's predecessor, I hasten to add. Now, why is his resignation important? It's important because it is the first time that a pope has done this for centuries, but secondly, by resigning, he relativized that notion that somehow or other there's a kind of a mystique of fatherhood, that the Pope is somehow our father and you can't resign from fatherhood. In fact, I think John Paul II actually said that you can't resign from fatherhood. So it's ironic that the man who condemned relativism, in fact, set a precedent that frees subsequent popes from the obligation to sit it out, no matter how incapacitated they are or how sick they are. Now, the key to understanding Benedict's resignation, I think, lies in the prolonged process of dying of John Paul II. John Paul was Pope for, in my view, too long, 26 years. I share that view with Cardinal or Saint Henry Cardinal Newman, who spoke of Pius IX being Pope for far too long. Now, Benedict, as Ratzinger, was very close to John Paul, and he feared that something similar might happen to him. He felt by 2013 that his strength was starting to go. I think he realized that his administration was collapsing around him, and so he acted. Now, it's interesting in the light of that, which I think was a very generous and a courageous thing to do. In the light of that, a quote I found many years ago from a church historian and quite a well-known feminist historian, a feminist theologian, the German Ute Ranke-Heinemann. And she actually studied, believe it or not, with Ratzinger at university. And she says the enormous difference between John Paul II and Ratzinger is intelligence. Ratzinger is much, much more intelligent. Ratzinger was much more of what the French call esprit de finesse. John Paul had none of that. And by finesse, she means delicacy, sensitivity. So I think that Benedict was sensitive to the fact that it was time to go. That was something that John never really, I don't think, ever entered John Paul's head. So while Ratzinger or Benedict's papacy, I think, will be seen as a mere interlude in church history, it certainly is the last hurrah for the Eurocentric church. That is the church that models itself entirely and totally on Europe. And Benedict's successor, of course, Pope Francis, is a man who is concerned not about Europe, he's a man who's concerned about the peripheries. And I mean, it's interesting just here in the Pacific where I live, where Marilyn and I live, we're very much part of the Pacific. We do not have a cardinal in Australia. George Pell was our last example of that, and not a very good example of a cardinal. But Dili, the capital of Timor-Leste, has a cardinal. Papua New Guinea has a cardinal in the Archbishop of Port Moresby, and at the tiny island of Tonga has a cardinal. Half the population of Tonga is Catholic and half Protestant, but they've got a cardinal there now. They also have a king in Tonga, so that'll be interesting. Who takes precedence, the king or the cardinal? I'll leave the Tongans to sort that out. But it is a symbol of the fact that the church has radically shifted from Eurocentrism to the peripheries. And I think that Francis, of course, has appointed an enormous number of peripheral cardinals, and they are going to have a big voice in the election of the next pope. But however, we're not talking about, we're looking backwards, which is against the prayer that Russ uttered for us, and we don't want to get caught in the past. But I think we can learn some real lessons from Benedict's papacy. Now, one of the things that Benedict is quite famous for is he made a distinction between what he called the hermeneutic of discontinuity or rupture, which sounds like a medical problem to me, and the hermeneutic of reform or continuity. Now, this word hermeneutic, it's a pretentious word for interpretation. So you either interpret Vatican II in terms of the fact that it was a complete break with the past, or it was continuous with the past, moving toward the future. I mean, only a German scholar would come up with hermeneutic as a word to explain what they were talking about. Now, clearly, Vatican II opted for the hermeneutic of continuity. For sure, there were big changes at Vatican II. Religious liberty is clearly one of them. John Courtney Murray, who fought for so many years, the American Jesuit, fought for so many years for religious liberty. Religious liberty, the vernacular liturgy, ecumenism, a real reconciliation with the Jewish people. They're clearly big changes at Vatican II. It introduced these new ideas, but at the same time, it maintained a sense of continuity with the past. It is ridiculous to think that somehow Vatican II kind of just simply cut off the past. Everything it did was new, and we're in a kind of completely new world with no sense of continuity at all. Unfortunately, Benedict became somewhat obsessed with this rupture theme, this breaking with the past. And the problem there is that he set up a false dichotomy. He's set up an either-or dichotomy, whereas in fact, Vatican II brought in new ideas, but it was continuous with the past. It continued the church's tradition, as we say. It handed on traditio, the verb tradere could fit in there, to hand on, just as the runner in the relay race hands on the baton. So Vatican II, drawing on the past, handed on the baton to the future. So I think that unfortunately, our friend Benedict created a rupture that we really didn't need to have. But what he did was that he opened the way for those who wanted to play that silly game of rupture, for them to kind of have an authority speaking for them. The only people who've created a rupture in the Catholic Church since Vatican II are the Lefebvrists, the people who are in schism, who followed Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. And Benedict spent a lot of time trying to make peace with the Lefebvrists. Most of us have not broken off. It's the Lefebvrists. So connected to this rupture theme is also another theme that was dear to Benedict's heart, what he called the dictatorship of relativism. I still remember being in Rome, listening to his speech as the Dean of the College of Cardinals before his election of Pope. I was in Rome covering his election. I covered his and the election of Pope Francis for both the Australian media, and quite a bit of the international media as well. I even got a few gigs on National Public Radio. I still remember standing in the Piazza of St. Peter's listening to this talk, and I was fortunate to have the translation in front of me so I could read it. And part of what he said was he denounced the dictatorship of relativism. Now here, he seems to be referring to what in kind of intellectual parlance these days we call postmodernism. This is a theory that dominates large swathes of Western culture, particularly in universities. The postmodernists tell you cannot have meta-narratives, and another pretentious word for a simple idea. By meta-narratives, they mean that there are no stories that convey binding truth to us. There is absolutely no such a thing as absolute truth. Well, I'm inclined to agree that there probably isn't such a thing as absolute truth, because human beings can't know anything absolutely. But I do think, and I agree with Benedict, that there is, we are able to attain some truth, a considerable amount of truth, and in fact, binding truth. I mean, in some ways, the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, was the ultimate postmodernist, because he denied there was not only no truth, there were no facts. There were no facts that could be ascertained. I'm sure that our Donald hasn't heard of, or he might have heard of postmodernism. Who am I to judge him? He may have a library of books on postmodernism down there at Mar-a-Lago. But that essentially was what postmodernism is saying. No truth, really, no binding truth. Now, Benedict is right to have reacted to that. Postmodernism needs a good critique. And to an extent, I agree with him. The postmodernists are telling us that the only experiences we have are our personal experiences or our community experiences. That's all that we've got. Well, I'd want to say we have a good bit more than that. But I'd also want to say that postmodernism is not of great interest to the vast majority of Catholics who now live in the developing world. People in the South Sudan or the Democratic Republic of Congo, recently visited by Pope Francis, or Kiribati out in the Central Pacific, which is gradually going under due to global warming, people there are really not concerned about relativism. They're concerned about survival. And so there's a sense in which, again, Benedict was addressing the developed world, and more specifically, the Eurocentric world. And in a way, that is the great change that has occurred between the two papacies of Benedict and Francis. Now, another thing that both Benedict and John Paul have done is they've left us with a bevy of dud bishops. In shaping the church to their peculiar agendas, both of them appointed bishops who, most of whom were representatives of head office, some of whom, especially in the United States and to a lesser extent here in Australia, some of whom are, of course, culture warriors ready for a fight on any given day. But in the end, really, especially with John Paul II, these bishops were a kind of, they were adding colour to John Paul's visits. I'll never forget covering World Youth Day in 2008. I was covering it for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and for another one of our other national broadcasters here, the Special Broadcasting Service, SBS. And there was a big, we call them jamboree. I don't, that's what Scouts have. I don't know whether you use that word in the United States, but anyway, a big gathering of 250,000 young people attending. They're at Randwick Racecourse, which is Sydney's premier, Royal Randwick it's called. And they were there, and there was a mass there that Benedict celebrated. And I cast my eye across the vast, colourful stage. It really looked like an opera. But on the stage, there was not a single lay person. They were celebrating Mass, of course. Not a single lay person, let alone one of those strange lay people, a woman. Not a single one of them on the altar. When I looked around the crowd of young people that were there, more than half of them were women. So I wondered how they felt. I think they were so enthusiastic. They were happy. But bishops. What I'm trying to say is, in some ways, I think both these popes saw bishops as altar boys. They were there to add colour. Now, when we look at who is primarily responsible for how we got these dud bishops and culture warriors, there are two blokes who come immediately into focus. By blokes, I mean guys. Two guys who come immediately into focus. One is a gentleman named Giovanni Battista Re, who was the prefect of the Congregation for Bishops from 2000 to 2010. And the other, and with apologies to any Canadians present, I did hear a few Canadians tuning in there, was Marc Ouellet, who is a French Canadian, who was prefect from 2010 to 2023. Now, these are the two guys who are primarily responsible, the papal nuncio or the apostolic delegate or whoever it is that sends the list into Rome. These are the two guys that then saw the list in Rome, and these are the two that presented the list of three names, the terna, as it's called, to the Pope. Now, just a little, let you in on a secret here. Ouellet, the French-Canadian guy, former Archbishop of Quebec, I think there's a Quebecer here. I think that I heard someone say that from Quebec. And greetings to you. It's a lovely city. Ouellet is a good friend of George Pell. So here's a mention of George to begin with. I know that the title is a Post-Benedict, Post-Pell church. Will be mainly Post-Benedict because Post-Pell is not all that important. But he was a good friend of George, and he made sure that shall we say, George clones were appointed to many dioceses in Australia, particularly the most important dioceses, Sydney, Melbourne, and a far less important diocese with respect to anybody from Hobart. Hobart, but 3 of George's clones run those dioceses. Interestingly, just last month or this month, I can't remember the exact date, but just within the last 2 weeks, Francis has they've changed the name of congregation. It's now called the Dicastery for Bishops. The Dicastery for Bishops is now run by a gentleman named Robert Prevost, or Prevost. I'll take a bet on it. He's born in Chicago, so if there are any Chicagoans present, you can fix us up on that. He's the former general, head boss of the Augustinian order, and after he'd finished as the head of the Augustinians, Francis appointed him a bishop in Peru. The Peruvian hierarchy is pretty conservative, and there are a few Opus Dei kind of guys there. And I think this was an attempt to bring in someone who was certainly reflected the Francis agenda rather than the any other agenda. But he now runs the Dicastery for Bishops. Why Francis waited 3 years to get rid of the Willette, I don't know, but there you are. That's what happened. Francis, a bit hard to interpret sometimes, but at least I think we can now hope that the Dicastery for Bishops is being run by somebody really who sympathises with the Francis agenda. Now, sticking with bishops for a moment, in 2 countries particularly, there was a deliberate policy which was begun under John Paul and continued under Benedict to replace the existing pastoral leadership, and I use the word pastoral there purposely because I'm talking about really strong pastoral bishops, to replace them with bishops, shall we say, more oriented to the agendas of John Paul II and Benedict, in other words, more oriented to culture warfare. The first of those countries was the Netherlands, Holland. It was pretty easy to replace the hierarchy there because there's only, I think, 9 or 10 bishops. And so, a few deaths and retirements, it was a done deal. The other place was a little bit more difficult. It's a place that most of you will be relatively familiar with. It's called the United States of America. Here, Pope Paul VI had appointed as apostolic delegate, this was before the delegate became the nuncio, Paul VI had appointed as apostolic delegate the Belgian Archbishop Jean Jadot. And it was clear that Jadot was instructed to appoint bishops who were more pastorally inclined, that is, who cared for their diocese and for their people and for the priests of their diocese. Now, with the advent of JP2, from about Jadot finished he was dismissed by JP2 in 1980. From that point onwards, there's been a series of papal nuncios who have appointed a very sizable group of bishops in the United States. Now, I know I'm telling you stuff you know already, but it's good to remember it. A very sizable group of bishops who are conservatives and some of them culture warriors who are openly opposed to the Pope Francis agenda. Now, Francis has improved that situation by appointing some pretty good bishops in the US, Tobin in Newark, the guy down in San Diego, whose name just escapes me for the moment, and Cardinal Supich in Chicago. So they've certainly improved the situation, but you still in the United States, it's, as an outside observer looking at you as someone who knows the States pretty well. I've just had a tip. McElroy was the name of the bloke in San Diego. Thanks, Russ. You still have a serious problem, and it's going to take some time to reorient the episcopal hierarchy to again pastoral care, which after all is the purpose of the church. The church is not here to run an ideology. The church is not here to promote some form of cultural warfare. The church is not here to maintain gender ethics in the entire society. The church is here to provide pastoral care, and we need pastoral bishops. Here in Australia, the situation is a little more mixed, as I suspect it is in the other in Canada and certainly in the UK that I know better, and certainly in New Zealand as well, our close neighbours here in Australia. The situation is more mixed. We do have some culture warriors. The Archbishop of Sydney, I think, would fit into that category. He's very much a Pell appointment. Less so, well, to some extent, the Archbishop of Melbourne, but generally speaking, our normal bishops, especially the bishops in the rural areas in Australia, are basically pastoral guys, and of that, and I'm very happy about that. As an example of that, I'll just tell you a story. It's how to get yourself dismissed as a bishop. This is the lesson of this story. It's the story of Bill Morris, the Bishop of Toowoomba. Bill was Bishop of Toowoomba from and I know that's a difficult word, Toowoomba. It's an Aboriginal word. It's got more O's in it than you can poke a stick at. He was Bishop of Toowoomba. Now, just get the size of this diocese. This is in southern Queensland. This diocese is 488,000 square kilometres in area. Now, it's worth comparing that to the entire state of Germany, which is 357,000 square kilometres. So Bill's diocese was much more than 100,000 kilometres bigger than Germany. Bill said quite straight, we've got a shortage of priests. We've got to look at ordaining married men. We've got to look at ordaining women. There's the rub. He was reported to Rome, and Pell certainly played a role in reporting him to Rome. He was also reported to Rome by what in Australia we call the temple police. I don't know if you have the temple police. These are the people whose job it is to maintain the orthodoxy of the church. And they probably would emphasize the preposition of the church. And at any rate, Bill was summoned to Rome. He had the cheek to say, I'm sorry, I've got a sexual abuse case that I'm dealing with here in a school here in Toowoomba. I'll be in Rome in a couple of months. I'll see you then. That didn't go down too well, because they expect that when you get a summons from the Cardinal, prefect of this or that congregation, you respond immediately. Eventually, he was summoned by B16. B16 said, I want your resignation. Bill said, I'm not going to resign, to his face. And so B16 said in Italian, I hire, I fire. And so Bill now is back doing pastoral work in the Archdiocese, the neighbouring Archdiocese of Brisbane. One of the best men I've ever met, Bill Morris, one of the best men I've ever met. They replaced him with a canon lawyer. So that's what happens to bishops who stand up. Now, that put the fear of God into the Australian bishops, and they threw Bill under the bus. They didn't hesitate to disown him. So that's why, guys, bishops are scared to speak out. Back to B16. And the liturgy. Now, the liturgy is pretty important in the Catholic Church. We are a sacramental church, and the Eucharist is very important. There was a guy working as a secretary in the department in Rome, the Dicastery for Divine Worship, then the Congregation for Divine Worship. He was a Sri Lankan gentleman who was primarily responsible for the excommunication, I don't know if you remember him, of Father Tissa Balasuriya. This guy's name is Malcolm Ranjith. Now, Ranjith, who was an auxiliary bishop or a local bishop at the time, is the guy who primarily reported Tissa to Rome, and Tissa was excommunicated for some 12 or 18 months. Now, Ranjith is the bloke who is responsible for this phrase, the reform of the reform. In other words, the reform of Vatican II. Now, the notion gained ground in Rome that Vatican II had abandoned the vertical or the spiritual aspect of the liturgy and thus secularized it. And in the English-speaking world, the Vatican II post-Vatican II ICEL, the International Commission for English in the Liturgy, their translation was described, that's the one we used to use before the present incubus was thrust upon us. It was described as banal, not true to the original, and lacking a sacred feel. Now, one of the most outspoken people in this area was our own great champion, George Pell. The beauty was gone, we were told, and the reactionaries claimed that the only way of fixing this, getting the beauty back and the sacredness, was to abandon the theory of translation that ICEL, the International Commission for English in the Liturgy, had adopted, which is called dynamic equivalence, abandoning that to a literal translation of the Latin. By dynamic equivalence, they meant we get the sense of what. I mean, that's how you translate. You don't literally translate because the grammatical structure of languages are different, and certainly the grammatical structure of Latin is different to that of English. They enshrined this in an instruction, this literal translation theory, in an instruction of the Divine Worship outfit, which was written, I love this, was written by the Chilean prefect at the time, Cardinal Jorge Medina Estevez. Now, I love it, the idea that a Chilean who presumably speaks Latin American Spanish was determining Shakespeare's language for us. I must admit, as a lover of the English language, I'm a little bit put out by that. The aim was to get to what was called timeless English, as though English stopped. It's going to be timeless. And this attempt to get timeless English was to be supervised by an English-speaking group of bishops, a committee called the Vox Clara, Clear Voice Committee, chaired by none other than Aussie's own Big George, George Pell. The result was that they sacked everybody who had worked in Washington, DC, for the International Commission for English in the Liturgy. And what we've now got, what has been imposed upon us, is a kind of pseudo mid-Victorian English, the kind of English Queen Victoria might have spoken, posing as sacred language, which was imposed on us all in December 2011. I'm not alone in criticizing this. The very prominent theologian, Father Gerard O'Collins, SJ, has written a book on this whole problem. It's not just me. I've described the present English in the liturgy is I put this in a pamphlet I wrote on this. I described it as the product of a third-rate Victorian novelist writing on a particularly bad day. And really, at times, that's what it sounded like. But Benedict's problems with the liturgy didn't finish with that. He's also made concessions to the Tridentine Mass Brigade. This is those who espouse the liturgical reforms of 1570. It came after the close of the Council of Trent in 1563. Pope Pius V, I think it was, that issued this liturgical reform in 1570. Now, in an apostolic letter in July 2007, Benedict XVI set up two forms of the liturgy that could be used. One was what he called the ordinary form, which was the Roman Missal promulgated by Paul VI. That's the one we use in the vast majority of parishes right now. And then there was the extraordinary form, which was the Roman Missal promulgated by Pope Pius V in 1570. That's what is generally seen as the conservative Tridentine Mass. Now, Benedict decreed that any priest, young or old, and I get very worried when I see newly ordained priests celebrating Mass in Latin, gets me a little concerned, that any priest can celebrate the extraordinary form without permission from anybody, and that, quote, in parishes where a group of the faithful attached to the previous liturgical tradition stably exists, the parish priest should willingly accede to their request to celebrate Holy Mass according to that Pius V Missal. Now, what this did was it was open slather. It opened the floodgates because the Tridentine Mass is a symbol of something. I know that the Latin Mass Brigade tell us they just want the beauty and the loveliness and that they can sing. And I love Gregorian chant and I listen to polyphony all the time. I'm one of the biggest fans of polyphony on YouTube you can meet. But all it is for most of them is a cover for the rejection of Vatican II. And Benedict XVI opened the floodgates to that. And Francis has had to close them. After a wide consultation with the bishops, Pope Francis has had to close these loopholes, and he issued an instruction, Traditionis Custodes, in July 2021, which has been tightened up by subsequent instructions from the Dicastery for Divine Worship, which is now run by Cardinal Roche, an English cardinal, severely restricting the celebration of the Tridentine Mass and liturgy, in order to maintain church unity and heal the schisms created by the anti-Vatican II people. And of course, Francis has come in for massive criticism for that. The final thing I want to talk about with regard to Benedict is that he's really let the Bureau, he really was not interested in governance. John Paul II wasn't interested in governance either. He was interested in globetrotting. Benedict was simply not interested in governance. At the beginning of his papacy, actually, I still remember John Allen. I'm sure many of you know who John Allen is. John and I were talking in the Piazza of St. Peter's after Benedict's election had been announced, the white smoke had gone up, etc., etc. And we both agreed that because B16 knew the Curia so well, that he'd be out there with his meat axe to deal with the dead wood. Well, how wrong John Allen and I were, because he simply was simply not interested in governance. Now that let the Vatican bureaucrats run amok. The Vatican became a seething morass of competing interests, not helped by Benedict's appointment of the power-hungry Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, who I have to say was very incompetent. And the machinations of Benedict's secretary, Monsignor, now Archbishop Georg Ganschwein. His nickname was Gorgeous George, and he controlled access to the Pope. I mean, a number of gay guys have told me how gorgeous George really is. And it was George who inspired Donatella Versace, the Italian designer, to create, I love this, the clerical look for men with more brain than muscle. That'd be me, really. So there you are. So not governing the place properly, the Vatican became a place of leaks, infighting, talk of an underground gay lobby, and the butler leaking papal documents. So I come back to where I began. In the end, Benedict made exactly the right decision to resign, and God bless him for doing so. He perhaps should have called himself Bishop of Rome Emeritus rather than Pope Emeritus, and it might have been better if he'd gone back to Germany or even to Bavaria, beautiful Bavaria, where he came from, near Mozart. He was born just close to Mozart's birthplace in Salzburg, just across the border in Germany. But he stayed on in the Vatican, but now he's gone, and may God bless him. Finally, and very briefly, George Pell. My judgment is that George Pell has left us a diminished church in Australia. His nickname was Big George. A certain acolyte of his, who is now an archbishop, is called Boy George. I won't say where this archbishop hangs out because I may get sued for defamation. George, who was born just 10 months after me in June 1941 in Ballarat, Victoria, George, some thought that he was destined to become an Australian rules footballer. I've actually umpired several matches that George played in when he was a seminarian, and I was a seminarian. And George was a rough player, tough, rough as bags, really, relatively skilled, but mainly brawn rather than brain. He had a blessed career right through the priesthood to end up as Archbishop of Melbourne, and then he was moved to become Archbishop of Sydney, made a cardinal, left there to become the prefect of the economy in Rome, then came back to Melbourne to be put on trial and sent to jail for 20 months, and then was cleared by the High Court of Australia, the equivalent of your Supreme Court, which basically said that there was a fear that an innocent man had been, the jury did not have the grounds to convict him, and that there was a fear that an innocent man had been convicted. Now, when I say diminish the church, just one or two points. The problem was that George had this boots and all approach to a dialogue with the community, let's put it that way. There was no equivocation, no compromise. The Catholic Church was right, had always been right, was established by Jesus, who established the church pretty much just as much as it is now, and that there was to be no backing off from that. And especially there was to be no equivocation on reproduction and gender issues, as if these issues were at the heart of the gospel. He loved taking them on. There was there's a television show in Australia called Q&A, question and answer. It's a bit of a dud program. It's mainly on because it's cheap to do. I know that because I used to work for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, who produces it. But anyway, at one time they had on George Pell versus, get this, Richard Dawkins. Remember our atheist friend Richard Dawkins? They called it the Clash of the Titans. Reviewing the program, I described it as the Clash of the Minnows. And that's what it was. But that George loved that type of thing, to get out there and, you know, into the boxing ring and throw a few punches at an atheist. The problem was the image of the church that projected to the community. You can see the same thing in quite a few of the US bishops. They're spoiling for a fight. And I'll conclude here with a word of praise. When he went to Rome, to the prefecture of the economy in 2014, I think it was, I wished him the best of British luck, because I thought he'd need it. He's a good financial manager. He's a very good financial manager, and he applied accountability and transparency to the Vatican. He brought in the big accounting firms like Price Waterhouse and Company to bring a level of honesty in the auditing of Vatican finances, which, of course, up until then had been run on a rob Peter to pay Paul and vice versa basis. I think he would have cleaned up the place quite well. His successor, the one Francis has appointed, is doing quite a good job. And I think that nowadays we can say, and George should get some real credit for this, the Vatican is in much better shape in financial terms. I'll stop there because I've talked too long, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Paul. This was brilliant. So we'll use the same system that we always use. You raise your hand. You can do it with the little reaction button, or if you can't figure that out, you can actually hold it up. But and we'll just call on you one by one. The one thing I wanted to start with, though, Paul, is how did the seminary produce a George Pell and a Paul Collins? You're so different.
We were in different seminaries.
Oh,
we were. I was in a religious order. We were given a first-class education. I went into, there's a famous Australian movie called The Devil's Playground, set in a junior seminary. Well, the junior seminary that I went into was nothing like that. We got a first-class classical education, and then our seminary education was second to none. Actually, the diocesan seminary that Pell went through at Corpus Christi College in Werribee in Melbourne, it was a Jesuit-run seminary, and it was well staffed, and they were well educated as well. But look, George is an ecclesiastical climber, and he knew the way up the ladder, and people like that are hard to beat.
Very good. Betty Ann, you have a question.
Thank you so much, Paul, for a superb presentation. Brought back awful memories of having meetings with some of those men in Rome. But can you tell us a little bit about the status of the discussion in the Australian Church about restoring women to the diaconate? How does that stand, and what do you think the prospects are?
Marilyn, my wife, should answer this, because she is one of those who is pushing that very, very strongly. Would you like, Marilyn, would you just quickly say something? You're better than me on this.
I'll just very briefly say that I'm very supportive of doing that, but there are some problems with it in terms of, and I would do that because I think it's already an existing order, and it wouldn't be quite the hurdle to get in, and it would put women into the conversation on ministry. But a lot of people that are working in the renewal movement would see ordination of Catholic women as the priority, whereas I sort of think we've got to get rid of this model, this very exclusive model of priesthood, and try to envision and create the sort of model that Pope Francis leads to, but doesn't specify how that's going to go, and he could if he wanted to. So I think it's absolutely vital to get women into the conversation. So I would be supportive of women's ordination to the diaconate as a first step. But then we would have to see, we have to review the whole of ministry and the concept of priesthood.
Yeah, I'm agreeing, not only because we're going to have lunch after this, but I'm agreeing because I agree. I think the question is ordination. And I personally believe we should spread ordination. I mean, this whole ontological change business is nonsense. It is literal. I'm doing a paper on it just at the present moment, and I'm convinced it's heresy. It's heresy. Because it's a comparison to the hypostatic union. That is, the priest is united to Christ in the same way as Christ is united to God. Excuse me? I don't know what council ever said that. Anyway, but whatever, I do think the question, and I would be ordaining anyone in a serious leadership role in the church, man or woman, laying on of hands. If you're a principal or a religious education coordinator in a Catholic school, laying on of hands. It's not permanent. It is assuring you that you represent the church and you represent the Christian message in an official way in your role. Anyway, that's a pet peeve at present for me, so
but Betty Ann, weren't you asking what the status is within the official church?
Yeah.
I think that's her question, was where does
How's the conversation going? What's the status of, where's the level of support in the bishops' conference, with Catholics writ large, what's the status of the conversation in the Australian church?
Marilyn.
Yeah. So we recently had the plenary council, and going through that council, the biggest issue in all the consultations was women's participation and equality within the Catholic Church. So one of the decrees during the plenary council was concerned with the dignity and equality of men and women within the Catholic Church, and there was a draft decree put up, and it didn't get passed the first time in the council, and that was to do with considering the ordination of Catholic women into the diaconate. So very interestingly, and I don't know how many times it's happened in other countries, but certainly the group that was there, the group of delegates, halted the meeting and said they did not want to, very respectfully, did not want to continue until that decree was addressed, and they wanted it to be revoted on, because the first time it went up, it didn't get through. They had to get a 2/3 majority from the bishops, because they were the only ones that really had a vote. There were other votes, but they were all advisory, so they didn't really count. So very interestingly, 60 of the people walked to the back of the room in silent protest, some priests and one bishop, and then the chair, another bishop, took leadership and actually got the whole clause reworded. And at the moment, that is a draft decree. Now it's
Can
not
I just,
worded the way that we would like it, and it's gone to Rome, but at least it would get women into the conversation. And so I think that was quite amazing. That's where it's at.
But to focus specifically on the question, really there's not much discussion of women's ordination to the diaconate in Australia, because people just simply don't know about it. We have as I suspect in the United States, with the exception of this group of people, a passive laity. And I think that's where the problem is.
Thanks, Betty Ann. Thanks, everyone. Paul and Marilyn. We'll go to Jane. You have a question?
Yes, I do. A question and a major concern. Despite the linguistical changes that were put upon us in 2011, my biggest concern is the theological changes that were embedded in that translation. For example, Jesus' saving action was no longer for all, but only for many.
Yeah.
And the great focus on our unworthiness and not our acceptance and love as children of God. That is what drove me away from the institutional church. And Michael, in fact, I even wrote to the Pope, but of course got no answer. But my concern was, it used to be all, and now it's many, and then maybe it'll be some, and you, and where were we going as far as our loving God and the message it was giving us as God's people?
Yeah. That's spot on, Jane, as a comment, absolutely spot on. Benedict argued, I always call him B16, argued that many meant all, because the underlying Hebrew word, I think it's a tortuous argument, the underlying Hebrew word meant all, but was actually translated many. Excuse me, there's no reason to do that. And of course, I just refuse to join in the I confess to Almighty God and beating breasts and so on and so forth, which is the point, exactly the point that you're making. The thing is a disaster. There is no other way to describe it. I come at it because I write a lot, and so I'm appalled by bad English. Appalled, but you're absolutely right about the theological kind of feel of this whole thing.
In the Spanish translation, it is still all.
Yeah. Well, the Germans refused to do it, as I understand it. I don't think the Germans have done anything. So bless the Germans.
Thanks, Jane.
Thank you. Thank you.
Joanna, you have a question.
Paul, thank you so much for your talk. I just have a couple of questions about Pell's legacy. I'm working here in Sydney, and through work and stuff, I do have a lot to do with people who have been affected by him in all kinds of ways. At the recording of Pell's funeral, his brother implied that once Pell found the missing billions in Rome, in the Vatican, that people had it in for him and wanted to destroy him, whether it was the mafia or whatever in Rome, and hence the case against him in Australia. I wondered what your thoughts were on that topic, and also what your thoughts were on that his legacy seems to me that it's almost become a bit cult-like and not in a good way. And I could give you specific examples, but I won't take up the time here. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Joanna. Look, on the notion that they were that smart in the Vatican, that they were able to send money to Australia and be able to manipulate things here, strikes me as ludicrous. One of the areas that I left out, and it's on the page in front of me here, but I was watching the time on the clock, was Pell with regard to sexual abuse, and here, I mean, I think we need to say that there were essentially two cases against Pell himself. One was the so-called cathedral case, which was the case that was tried and was thrown out by the Australian High Court, then after he'd served the 20 months or so in jail. But there was another case called the swimmers case, which was about behaviour in a swimming pool when he was a priest in Ballarat. That case was never prosecuted. The police decided not to go ahead with it because there was not enough. They were not worried that the witnesses would not stand up in court. So that case was dropped. But I mean, you've reminded me of his brother's address. I mean, I think that he's shown up by the John Ellis case in Sydney. This is a case that of a man who, as a 13-year-old altar boy, was abused by a priest. And the man's name was John Ellis. He's quite public about it. He is a lawyer, and Pell sought to vigorously defend the church against Ellis to discourage survivors of abuse from seeking compensation from the church. And that is a finding of the Royal Committee, or the Royal Commission that was set up by the Australian government to look at the whole sexual abuse business. So he fought Ellis in court, and Ellis was treated abominably, not only by the legal system, but also by the Archdiocese of Sydney, where Pell was Archbishop. So when I say that he has left us a diminished church, they're the kind of things that I have in mind. Now, you had one other point, Joanna, which I've missed. What was it?
It was, I've got a practical experience of this, but it seems to me that a lot of people who followed him and his legacy, and people who, other bishops or priests who followed him and the seminarians, that they have become like a cult in Sydney. And that's what I've noticed pretty well close up. And I just wonder what your thoughts on that were.
I think that's true. It is a Sydney culture, absolutely correct. The interesting thing about Pell is he comes from Victoria. He was Archbishop grew up near Melbourne. He was Archbishop of Melbourne, but in fact it was in Sydney that he made a hit. And the conservative Catholic money in Sydney is certainly very much on Pell. Was very much supporting Pell. I think that he has had some inroads into the Liberal Party in New South Wales, in the Sydney, but again, because there's an election coming up there in about 10 days, so I better not pontificate politically. But yes, I think there is a cult of Pell in Sydney.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Peter, you have a question.
Paul and Marilyn, thanks very much for your answers on the situation for ordaining women as deacons in Australia. I just want to take the opportunity to quote what actually was said by the Plenary Council in its decree, because it seems to me to be the sort of language that Pell very much championed in Australia, and the Australian bishops and probably bishops elsewhere use all the time. Some Catholics actually believe that the Plenary Council supported the ordination of women as deacons. I don't think there's any more qualified decree in all the decrees of the Plenary Council than this particular one. And if I can read it to you, it'll show how people get misled in this way. It says that should the universal church of the law of the church be modified to authorise the diaconate for women, the Plenary Council recommends, not decides, the Plenary Council recommends that the Australian bishops examine, not implement, how best to implement it in the context of the church in Australia. That virtually is a very clever way of saying nothing and adopting no position, and yet has been represented by many as support by the bishops. I just wonder whether, Paul, you'd like to comment. I mean, there was a report that you and Marilyn are well aware of in the late 90s, Women and Men, One in Christ Jesus, which was expert at this, at saying all the right things about the beauty of women, something like the icing on the cake comment of Francis, I guess, which gave people a lot of comfort, but didn't do anything and wasn't implemented in any effective way. Just the use of that sort of language, Paul.
Well, that's church talk. What do you expect, Peter? Look, I'm conscious I don't want to get caught too much on Australian affairs here, interesting as this country might be. Look, yeah, in the end, the Plenary Council is a joke, because in the end, only the bishops get to decide. And you had to get 2/3 of them to begin with. And then what they decide has to go to Rome and be cleared by every dicastery in sight. So give me a break. This is, Francis is right. Synodality that is not just extended to bishops, but synodality that includes the whole church is what we need.
Thanks, Peter. Tom Groom, you have a question. Tom Groom, are you still there?
Yeah, he's muted.
There he is.
Okay, here we are. Well, it would be going backwards, and Paul, lovely to see you. It would be going backwards, but maybe let me make my comment quickly. I wanted to say, if there's not much talk about ordaining women deacons in Australia, then we should send Phyllis Sagano to you for a couple of weeks, and she would get the fire lit down there. But in an old Irish seminary years ago, I learned that the three orders were an expression of the same sacrament.
Exactly.
And that indeed, if you agree to ordain people to the diaconate, that then they're also entitled to be ordained to the priesthood and to the episcopacy, and that these are not three different sacraments. There are different expressions or different functions of the same sacrament. So I'm bewildered by that. And I wondered, Paul, am I right in claiming, in being, as I was taught so long ago, that in fact, to admit to one is to admit to the other two as besides?
Exactly. You and I both know that's right, because we were formed in a proper seminary. So in the old days, Tom. Yeah. No, exactly. I mean, it is one sacrament, and it is deacon, priest, bishop, for goodness sake, and that's the same sacrament. So if you ordain women to diaconate, there is absolutely no reason why you can't ordain them to priesthood and to the episcopate.
There'd be no ontological difference between the three.
Yes, but from my perspective, I've been studying the theology, or more importantly, the spirituality of Cardinal Pierre de Bérulle, who is the French source of much of this ontological argument. And I've been looking at him, and it comes into the whole system via Jean-Jacques Ollier, who was the founder, who was the parish priest of Saint-Sulpice in Paris, and was the founder, essentially the source of the Sulpicians, who teach in seminaries, particularly in North America. The first two seminaries in North America were in Montreal and in Baltimore. That, I think, the real question, and here to some extent I don't disagree with Phyllis Sagano, and I do agree that if you go to diaconate, you're going to have to go to priesthood, and if you go to priesthood, you're going to have to go, as the Anglicans learned, to the episcopate. But to me, the real question is what we mean by ordination. That is, I think, the question for today.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Okay, we've got to I'm going to take just one more. We're way past our time. So Grace, you want to give me your question, and then we're going to have to say good night or good day. Let Paul get some lunch.
Yes, I was referring back to what Jane had said about the use of language. An acquaintance of mine asked her parish priest. She said, I do understand that in the liturgy, when it says man, it means men and women. And her parish priest said yes. And she said, well, if that's true, then why are women not allowed to be priests? He said, well, that's a case where it just means men. So, why is it that the language is just so twisted? When the women priests here in Baltimore celebrate liturgy, preside over it, it's inclusive language.
Yes, yeah. Look, welcome to what was it in 1984? Doublespeak, or I mean, we engage in it all the time in the church, look, I've been supported I've supported the ordination of women for the last 30 years. And in fact, in my examination by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, that was really one of the major issues that I had publicly supported the ordination of women. And it was for, as Bill Morris, the bishop I referred to from Toowoomba, it was for Bill, it was the key issue. These men, well, look, they live in cloud cuckoo land, and I really, unless we tackle the role of women and equality in the church, our church will be reduced to a sect. And it won't be a very pleasant sect, because it'll still be run by silly men. So the question of women is absolutely central to our church. If I'm sad to say, I don't think Pope Francis understands that. While Laudato Si, his encyclical on the environment, is probably the most revolutionary document ever written by a pope, he still falls into a failure to recognize the equality of women, and in fact attacks reproductive health as a plot of the West to reduce developing world population. Well, that in a way is sad, but we do have to come to grips with the question. It's not a question. We do have to come to grips with equality.
Right.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Grace. We, as wonderful as this has been, and we could go on all night there. I know there are questions in the chat room and other questions, but we've got to call it a night here and a day for Paul and Marilyn so they can eat. So I'm going to turn it back over to Russ, who is going to do the final prayer and thank you. And again, thank you, Paul. It's just been marvelous to listen to you, and Marilyn. Thank you both. It's just wonderful to have you with us. And thank you for all the work that you do. You make the church a better place, that's for sure.